All right, at long last, we finally have wandered our way into the books of Kings. So now let's start to address some of these issues you've already paid attention to, but maybe now you're going to start to see them with a little more nuance and understanding. So first of all, you know that whole set of questions that you want to ask as you approach any particular book, right? One big question here is, what is the structure of this book? So pretty simply, we can say that this book is chronologically structured, right? It starts at the beginning and goes to the end of the monarchy. And you notice that you have this interweaving of kings of the north and the south following roughly chronological structure. That said, remember that in the middle, you have this whole big chunk of material that's Elijah and Elisha material, which seems to be a separate source or two sources. So you have an Elijah narrative and an Elisha narrative, and they're kind of plugged in between. So it's not all chronological. You also get topical elements thrown in there, especially prophetic oracles and accounts of different prophets. We'll come back to the prophet stuff later. So it's chronological, sort of. Mostly. The date, when you want to find out the date of a book, what you look for is what we call terminus a quo and terminus ad quem. Aren't you glad to know that? Basically, the earliest possible date and the latest possible date. The earliest possible date would be based upon the latest datable person or event that's in the text, right? The text has to be written after the last thing that it mentions. So we just talked about Jehoiakim in exile being released. The text has to be written after that. So that determines the terminus a quo, the earliest possible date. And then the latest possible date would be like somebody else using it. Right, somebody else quoting that, like the chronicler, for example, right? So the book of Chronicles, you'll hope you're going to be reading that soon. Already read it. All right. So, all right, First Chronicles. So Second Chronicles, you're going to be reading them. So the books of First and Second Chronicles have a copy of Samuel and Kings. They're using it and they're adapting it. Okay, so keep that in mind. So whenever that was written, sets the terminus ad quem, the latest possible date. There's more to it than that. Sometimes you get archaeological discoveries that help you date something, but those are the basic things that we look for. So probably this text was written during the Babylonian exile, or finally put together from these earlier sources during the Babylonian exile. And the sources, that's another question you always want to ask of any text that you're reading. What sources did this guy have available to him? Sometimes he will tell you, right? Sometimes he'll say, take a look at the annals of the kings of Israel, right? He'll let you know he has a source. Sometimes he won't. He doesn't tell you, hey, I have an Elijah source here, but it sure looks like he probably does. Okay, very well. And so, by the way, the chronicler is going to tell you a whole bunch of sources the chronicler has available that apparently were not available to the person writing First and Second Kings. So the chronicler is working with a richer environment in terms of sources. Major themes in the text, of course, you always pay attention to these themes. The covenant, right? God's covenant strategy, right? How is God at work shaping this people to be a people after God's own heart? The ups and downs of the chosen people according to their choices. Largely, it is a story of faithlessness, right? It is mostly a negative story, which is interesting that the Hebrews would keep such a negative story about themselves. There is theological questions. That is, what does this text tell us about God? How is God portrayed? In these texts, God is remarkably patient. But God is also jealous. And God is very interested in wooing his people and keeping on in working with them despite rejection after turning away after turning away. And there always seems to be this idea of a remnant. There's always somebody to be responsive to God, even if it's not very many. There's values expressed in the text. Obviously, a big value is monotheism. Worship one God and worship Him alone. There's a big emphasis on Jerusalem as the place that was talked about in Deuteronomy. There's emphasis on high places as places where other gods are worshipped. There's emphasis on the good king and the bad king. And of course, the themes of Deuteronomy. Yes?
When I was reading, it talked about how Solomon had done sacrifices, but they were at local locations.
Yes.
But all of a sudden, it almost seemed like it was a negative thing because he was like blending with the other people. I just
That's
didn't
right.
know why it was. What is the big deal about the king doing at local places? Is he supposed to do it at high places, or what? Like.
Okay. I think I'm going to be answering your question in detail as we go. So let me put it on hold. If I haven't answered it sufficiently, please ask again, okay? But I think we're going to be getting there in probably more detail than you want. Okay. One other thing that's very important to bear in mind here is these texts have a southern bias, right? That is, only the southern kingdom has anything good about it. The northern kingdom never has anything good about it, does it? Right? So the south, of course, is where Jerusalem is. So the bias, south is God's place, God's country, right? Jerusalem is God's place. And you people from the north, you keep screwing up. You need to come be one with us. If this text were written by somebody in the north, you'd probably get a pretty different story, wouldn't you? Why are you people in the south making us keep coming there, right? So bear that in mind. There is a southern bias at work in this text. Okay. Now we need to work out a few nitty-gritty details because I'm a historian and I worry about such things. And you probably don't worry about them too much, but just to keep track of such things. Number one, there's lots of biblical references to the so-and-so started reigning in the 5th year of this other king, and then he reigned for so many years, and then went on. So all these references to the years of when somebody reigns. If you actually try to do the math, it gets really confusing. I'm kind of crazy, so I do these kinds of things. So I actually pay attention to the numbers and try to work them out and try to see how they fit. And by the way, did we get those Xerox pages? Anybody? Do we have? Not yet. Okay, you are going to get, so we'll talk more about these things later when you get them. So I will give you a chronology, which I think is the best one I've seen somebody try to work out. But let me say a few things. Number one, it's hard to know exactly when somebody's reign started because we have relative dating. So-and-so was the 5th year of this other king, but we're not exactly sure when the other king was, so how do we, so the synchronism is a little bit hard to work out. Number two, do you start from like the month the king started to reign, or do you start from the beginning of the next year? And if you start from the beginning of the next year, is it January or a different date? Like, do you go with the Jewish calendar, or how do you work that out? And even how is the Jewish calendar working during this period of time? So that gets a little bit confusing. So it's not as simple as you might think. Then it gets more complicated because every once in a while you have a father and a son reigning at the same time. They overlap. This is actually good practice among kings, right? Father rules for a while, son comes of age, and he makes son co-ruler for a while. They overlap a little bit, and then son's ready to roll when daddy dies. Well, we know about this. There's a handful of cases in the books of Kings where it mentions, remember Jotham, he has leprosy, and his son rules along, well, that makes sense because he's a leper, he can't do very much, right? So son has to do for him. So you get a few of these cases where the overlap is named, but there's more than what we know. The reason I say that is because there's no way the math works otherwise. So you have to account for some overlapping of kings, but we don't know how many or how much. So that's a little bit confusing. We have biblical references to people who are outside the Bible, like Tiglath-Pileser III or Shishak attack, right? So that helps us, because then we can cross-reference with something outside. We also have references in texts outside the Bible that refer to things inside the Bible. Say, for example, Ahab in the Battle of Karkar, that is referred to in Assyrian sources. So we can kind of cross-check when we have those things available to us. And then, of course, we have archaeology, and sometimes we can use burn layers and things like that to help calibrate. So when you try to develop a chronology of what king ruled when through all of this, those are the factors you take into account to make sense of it. And you can do a pretty darn good job of it, but I just wanted you to get a sense of the nuts and bolts of how you actually come up with a chronology of these kings. So any dates that you see, you will see some disagreement among them because there's room for disagreement. There's room for sorting among these issues. So what I will give you is, I think, the best I've seen, but there's room for argument. And so don't take everything I say on faith. But of course, you do know that everything I tell you is absolutely true. Just be clear about that. All right, now I'm really going to mess your head up. Numbers in the Bible, especially numbers in the Old Testament. You might have been troubled by these on occasion. How do I make sense out of those numbers? So now I'm going to try to help you make sense out of all numbers in the Old Testament. Okay? And when I get through, you'll be thoroughly confused, and that's just where I want you. So, first of all, sometimes, rarely as it turns out, but sometimes you get literal numbers in the Old Testament. So when you talk about the reigns of some of the, most of these kings, you're actually getting, so-and-so reigned for 43 years or whatever. That's, in many cases, a literal number usually. But that's actually unusual in the Old Testament. We Americans tend to be rather simple-minded. We like literal numbers. We like, if the reign says 43 years, dang it, it's 43 years. Well, that's not how the Hebrews think about numbers, generally speaking. So we have to think bigger thoughts. Very commonly, they round numbers. So you get even numbers when even number, like how many people were in this group, and you get an even number, right? A number rounded off to the thousands or the hundreds or whatever. So you get round numbers. That happens a lot. Very, very, very often in the Hebrew Bible, you get symbolic numbers. Now, we Americans hardly ever use symbolic numbers, so we're not used to this way of thinking, but Hebrews love it. So you might be familiar with the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah is all kinds of symbolic numerical interpretations of things. I mean, there's all kinds. So symbolic numbers are really important. So, simple rule of thumb. Think in terms of 7s, 10s, and 12s. Think of all the 7s. Right? Sabbath, 7 days of creation. Well, one of them is resting, obviously. That kind of stuff. Think of 10s, right? 10 commandments, etc. Think of 12s, 12 tribes of Israel, 12 disciples. This kind of 12 allotments of land, etc. So be very careful. 7 is the number of perfection. 7 is the number of Sabbath. 7 is the number of God. 7 is the number of rest. So 7 is very important. 10 has to do with the commandments, right? This is the heart of the Torah. 12, So and what they do is they love multiples of this stuff. So I will tell you, if you see a number and it's a multiple of 7, or if it's a multiple of 10, or if it's a multiple of 12, it is very probably intended to be symbolic. So if you take it literally, you're wrong. You are misinterpreting the text. Okay? You're always looking for the author's intent for the original audience. The audience is always looking for this. They love it. They love to see symbolic numbers. Authors love to play with symbolic numbers. So get used to it. If you ever see these numbers, any multiples of these things, a bell should go off and you're going to say, I bet you that's symbolic. Okay, I can see what they're doing. And you're supposed to smile, right? When you smile, you acknowledge, I get what you're doing. Okay, that's cool. But if you try to take the number literally and try to fit it together, you're just going to go crazy and you're going to misinterpret the text. All right. Now, so far, you're probably with me. Now I'm going to really mess you up. The Aleph problem. So the Hebrew word for 1,000 is Aleph. But the problem is the word doesn't only mean 1,000. The word also means a military leader, and the word also means a group. Wow. Okay. So, or it can mean a soldier also, a squadron of the military or something. So, and here's where some of those numbers that you might have struggled with, especially in Exodus, for example, if you do a literal reading of the numbers in Exodus, you're going to go crazy. And by the way, you're going to try to get 2 million people crossing the Red Sea, which, by the way, will take 2 weeks. You know, you start getting into absurdities when you start taking the numbers literally that were not intended that way. And by the way, you've got to try to then fit 2 million people into Israel. Good luck with that. These numbers, the problem here is Aleph in many cases. So watch out for the Alephs. So for example, if you see the number 46,600, number one is divisible by 10, so right away you should say, okay, what about that? It's also a round number, so right away you got 2 issues going on. But then in Hebrew it says 43 Alephs and 600. Well, is that 43,000 people? Or is it 43 leaders? Or is it 43 soldiers? Or is it 43 squadrons? And 600. Very probably what this word means, still rounded off and still possibly symbolic, is in fact not 43,600 people, but 43 leaders and 600 people, which would be 643 people instead of 43,600 people, which is a really, really big difference, right? So this happens a lot. So just beware that you can have an Aleph problem going on. And by the way, that puts you, sometimes your number is going to change by a factor of 3. It's a big change. Then it gets worse. So ancient texts, there was no printing press before 1453 AD. Before that, every text passed down to us was copied by hand. Texts that are copied by hand, people make mistakes. Now, thankfully, modern people can compare ancient texts to each other, and we can get behind the mistakes and find out what the original was a lot of the time, most of the time. But the cases where we have real trouble getting back to the original, and by the way, you'll notice different spellings of names. If you look at different translations of the Bible, you see different spellings of names. That's because names are the most messed up thing by copyists. Okay, if they're going to mess something up, it's going to be a name. So you get all kinds of texts with, and I do this, compare ancient manuscripts to each other and try to figure out what was the original. And you can do this, and you can do it well. By the way, the Dead Sea Scrolls really helped us with this because we could compare much later Hebrew manuscripts with then manuscripts that are over 1,000 years older and compare them. That was really nice. But we just don't have that many manuscripts for the Hebrew Bible. So the result is that names and numbers are the 2 most common scribal mistakes. So even after you pay attention to all these other issues, you may still have a scribal issue going on. We call this a textual variant with any particular number you're looking at. Okay? So, just be thoughtful when you encounter numbers and recognize that any of these things could be going on. Or to put it another way, at least for those of you who are from the United States, because we tend to think literally. We like literal numbers. So we have to cure ourselves of that habit. So what I would say to you, at least, who tend to think like I do, remember, I also do the math on these things, so it's, so I have driven myself crazy about them a number of times. If you are careful about looking at these things, just make the assumption that the numbers are not literal, unless there's really good evidence that they must be. Okay? Otherwise, they're probably rounded, or probably symbolic, or you probably have an Aleph problem, or something like that going on. And only if you can eliminate all those things do you get down to the literal. Now, all of that being said, in the books of Kings, you probably have more literal situations than just about any place in the Bible. So it is worth paying attention to the numbers, but then when you do, you still have these issues of co-regencies and that sort of stuff. All right, are you thoroughly confused?
Yes.
Yeah, good, all right, that's good. Yeah.
So what are some numbers, like examples, that you consider literal? Like, you say like the tribes and stuff like that?
Well, the tribes are pretty easy. Yeah, I mean, the later multiples of 12. Well, even it's interesting. You'll get lists of the tribes, and they'll say, here are the 12 tribes, and they'll give you 13. Right? So that shows you, that kind of thing happens a lot. You know, the half tribes, so you get that, and of course, then you get the Levi factor because they don't get land, and yeah. So even with that, you do get variation. But the king reigns. In Kings, so and so reigned for 43 years. Very often that is something that I think you can take literally in the text. You can eliminate the other factors, and it makes sense, and you can do the math, and you can work it out reasonably. So that's an example of literal. Yeah.
Do you have a note for us about the scripture being trustworthy despite scribal errors?
Oh, absolutely. So, so what I'm trying to get at actually is I operate, as I said at the beginning, I operate on the assumption that the Bible is true and the Bible is trustworthy. The question then becomes, what do I mean by that? That doesn't mean my interpretation is trustworthy, right? That means the Bible is trustworthy. And so if I'm imposing a literal interpretation on a number that was meant symbolically, then I'm actually misrepresenting. My interpretation is misrepresenting something that was, according to the author's intent, doing something trustworthy, namely giving a symbolic number. When it comes to scribal errors, I can say this, and I've done textual criticism a lot, and I teach textual criticism. I teach Greek, and I teach people the comparison of the manuscripts and so on. And by the way, this is actually fairly objective. That is, pretty much all scholars would agree with what I'm about to say. That when you do all the comparison of manuscripts to one another in the New Testament, you can be 98 to 99% certain that what you get in your Greek New Testament is the original. You can compare them, and you have enough to work with that you can get back to that level of accuracy. So yeah, there's that 1% where you say, there could be a scribal error here that just, we don't know. There's enough variation in the manuscripts that we can't get behind it to the original. By the way, almost always those things are like, is it the or a? Is it us? Is it a classic Greek problem is the original word you or us? And it makes almost no meaning difference in the text. But I would say really super high. Let's put it another way. The textual evidence we have available for the Bible, we have more available, and we have more ability to be accurate in our reconstruction of the original than any other text in the ancient world by far. By far. Only Homer is close. Just to give you an example, we have 24,000 manuscripts in the New Testament we can compare with each other. With Homer, we have about 300. With everything else, we're getting into double digits. Okay? So we have so much to work from. It is so much more trustworthy than anything else from the ancient world in terms of textual criticism. The Old Testament is a little bit different because we don't have as many manuscripts. And we have a totally different tradition of scribal copying. But what we do, the Dead Sea Scrolls is our big ace in the hole in that respect, because some of the Dead Sea Scrolls date back to about 150 BC. And before they were discovered, our oldest Hebrew manuscripts were about 1000 AD. And when we could compare over 1,000 years worth of copying to what was there in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it shows that the copyists were super accurate. They're called Masoretes, and they had techniques for things like when you read the Hebrew Bible, these Masoretes, these textual copyists, would have little notes in the margins, and the little note will say, here is the middle word in this book. So that enables them to count backwards and count forward to make sure that the number of words is equal so that they make sure they haven't made a mistake. So there's all these double check mechanisms that are built in. This is the 4th time this word has been used in this text, and you can work your way backwards and see. And so these so-called Masoretic notes gave this level of precision to Hebrew copying that nobody else did. So that's just the tip of the iceberg, but that's a partial answer to your question anyhow. Okay. All right. I tell you what, I think probably we ought to stop here. and then, because we're going to get into, now we'll actually go into the text, we'll start dealing with Solomon and so on, but I think since we're right up against the end and you got to talk about homework, is that all right? All right.